The idea of races and that there are differences between these categories of people was swept into the study of eugenics, which emerged in the early 1900s. You may have heard about this, and it being the basis of a movement in Germany to eradicate the Jewish population. Right around the 1930s, the idea that one could do selective breeding to improve not just agricultural stock, but also to improve the quality of racial generations of peoples, that idea started to gain favor. Thus, some governments determined that for the betterment of society, they should adopt policies that encourage some people to have children and others not to reproduce. Some states in the U.S. decided that interracial couples should not be allowed because this would dilute the pure stock of Caucasian blood and be detrimental to society. Forcible sterilization was imposed in the United States for those people that were seen to have diminished intellectual capacity and even sometimes the poor. Forcible, also sometimes called compulsory, sterilization was based on the idea of eugenics, and that some people had essential defective genetics, and reproduction of these people would be detrimental to society as a whole. It's worth noting that while compulsory sterilization is not legal in the United States now, but the U.S. was the first country to undertake these types of programs. In the United States, the Progressive Era policies from the 1890s until the 1920s supported this type of population control. Eugenics had two essential components. First, its advocates accepted as axiomatic that a range of mental and physical handicaps, blindness, deafness, and many forms of mental illness, were largely, if not entirely, hereditary in cause. Second, it assumed that these scientific hypotheses could be used as the basis of a social engineering across several policy areas, including family planning, education, and immigration. The most direct policy implications of eugenics, though, were that mental defectives should not produce children, since they would only replicate these deficiencies. And the other policy was that such individuals from other countries should be kept out of the United States. The principal targets of the American sterilization program were the intellectually disabled and the mentally ill, but also targeted under many state laws were the deaf, the blind, people with epilepsy, and the physically deformed. While the claim was that the focus was mainly the mentally ill and disabled, the definition of this during that time was much different than today's. For instance, at that time, there were many women that were sent to institutions under the guise of being feeble-minded because they were promiscuous or became pregnant while unmarried. These laws were the basis of the miscegenation laws, meaning laws that forbid interracial couples from intermarrying. One of the more well-known laws that impacts race in the U.S. is what's known as the one-drop rule. According to these laws, if a person had one drop of African American descent, often interpreted to be if the person just had 1/32 of their heritage as African American, then they were considered to be black. 1/32 would mean that if one great-great-great-grandparent, and that means 5 generations back, was African descent, then that person was black. This is what's known as hypodescent, i.e. that if a child has a mixed heritage, that they are automatically given the status of the parent with the lower racial status. Many of the states passed what were known as miscegenation laws to prevent any kind of intermarriage. These laws made it illegal for the races to intermarry. These laws were still being enforced by the 1960s. However, in 1967, an interracial couple, Mildred and Richard Loving, challenged the law, and the United States Supreme Court overruled the miscegenation laws, stating that states could not make interracial marriage illegal. Jim Crow laws refer to laws that mandate that the races be segregated. And the fact was that facilities that were designed for non-whites were usually underfunded and inferior. These facilities included schools, transportation, eating establishments, and any other kind of public accommodation. Hospitals could refuse to treat non-whites, and the military created special units or platoons for non-whites to keep the races segregated. Ghettos created racial segregated housing. Most people think in terms of the race riots that occurred during the 1960s civil rights movement, but there were race riots well before then. After slavery was outlawed in the 1860s, many blacks moved north to urban areas. By the 1900s, there were large numbers of Southern blacks living in urban centers in the north. There was a great deal of unrest as the demographics of the cities changed and minority populations grew. Blacks were intimidated through the burning and ransacking of their homes and being attacked if they had to travel, such as to work, through white neighborhoods.